I think that started. Nice. Now, just share my screen. There you go. So everybody, thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join this webinar. This is a great opportunity for us to talk about some upcoming functionality we have coming in Peoplevox. And to give you a little bit of an agenda as to what's happening, we'll talk through what the functionality is, some FAQs, and also you have an opportunity to answer the questions, and we can show you a little sneak peek behind the scenes of what this will look like. So please don't be shy, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So as we kick off, just like to do some introductions. So we've got myself, Amandeep, from the customer success team. My job here is to help you get the most out of Peoplevox and to help your warehouse run as efficiently as possible. And we've got Matt, our guest speaker for today's webinar. Matt, would you like to come say hello to everybody?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Matt. I'm on the product team here at Peoplevox. I've been here about 10 years now, originally from the UK.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. So let's dive right in. So first things, RMA. What is it? In logistics, I appreciate we've got a million different acronyms, and here's a new one to add to the collection. So RMA is Returns Merchandise Authorization, or Returns Authorization, and it's a part of what we call pre-alerted returns. Throughout this, we'll talk about pre-alerted and blind and explain the differences between the two. Essentially, pre-alerted means the warehouse knows a return is coming. So most people here will already use Peoplevox returns. The majority of Peoplevox users do. There's two ways of doing that, through the web app and the Android. Both options will be available going forwards with the new RMA functionality. So this RMA functionality will be included with the returns module with no extra charge, which is fantastic. It simplifies things. It reduces barriers to getting this on board and trying it. And the current process is blind. So earlier when we mentioned about pre-alerted versus blind, blind means you don't know a return is arriving at the warehouse until it's been arrived and has been processed. Which means from when the customer sends something to you receiving it, there's a big gap in data, maybe some tracking information somewhere, but not easily accessible to the wider business. And most importantly, when you're talking about a return currently, it needs to be linked to an original sales order in Peoplevox. So when you process the return, you'll scan the original sales order, it's come back in, and the items and so on. But without the original sales order, you can't process it. So these are some of the things that we're looking to improve. And this is geared towards returns from your customers. So something you've sold that has come back, not returns back to suppliers. So when we talk about who this is for, I've broken this down into two halves. So when we talk about you as a retailer, someone with your own operation, are you spending more processing returns, more time? Generally speaking, probably yes. It's a part of selling online. It's a part of that life. We need to offer returns to simplify things for customers, but we can help get that faster. Moving information between different systems, quite often we see a disconnect between customer service and the warehouse, sometimes finance, as to where in the journey that return is and what's the latest if a customer inquires. And finally, we talk about automating refunds. So this is both important for you and for your customer. So when we talk about your customer, we can talk about some of the things. So we look at the confirmation of returns received. Why is this important? If you've ordered something and you're unhappy for whatever reason, or you'd like to return it, you've dropped it off at maybe a Hermes parcel shop or arranged a courier collection, whatever that may be, and you don't really know it's been received unless you go out and actively track that shipment, which most people don't tend to do. So but by being able to capture when that return's arrived, by knowing what's in its way, we can help trigger things like that. Faster refunds. This can be done by capturing what was meant to turn up against what has turned up, and if it's the condition we think it's in, we can then create a webhook which can be used for triggering refunds somewhere else. And the potential to process returns online. This is getting more and more common, using some type of returns portal, whether that's in-house or a third party. And this helps cut down the need on packing slips. Not only is cutting down the need on packing slips speed up dispatch by eliminating the need for A4 printers, it also helps go paperless and one more in another way. So here is some of the assumed logic. So I must stress this is a feature currently under development. So this is sort of the logic that we're looking to use for it. So the RMAs will be managing an external system. So if we use the example of a returns portal, that's where your customer will go on and say, I've ordered this dress, it's too small, I'd like to return it. Fantastic. That data is captured there, managed there. The original sales order can be multiple packages. That won't be a problem. But the items coming back will be in a single package. Again, this is some of the assumed logic we're working with. And there will be no requirement to track the historical changes over time for the RMA. Essentially, we just want to know what's the status right now. Has it been received or has it not been received? So when we talk about the journey, I think this bit here is a nice way to illustrate what that means for the RMA, for ultimately your customer's return. So the return is requested on the portal, or the data is captured there. That information is then sent into Peoplevox. Now, for those of us who use purchase orders, you'll see the purchase orders uploaded on Peoplevox and at goods and they know what to expect. It's a similar type of concept where we'll know what return is coming to Peoplevox, what items, what type of condition they're in, and then we know what to expect. Then when it physically arrives, the return is processed either on the website or on the Android device. And then that data is then captured and it can be used to help trigger things like refunds, potentially re-in-stock notifications to customers and things like that. But crucially, on the digital side for the portal, your customer service and the warehouse will know exactly what's going on with that shipment as soon as it's being requested from the customer. And everyone can see that journey from start to end, regardless of which systems they have access to. Ultimately, this leads to what we call one source of truth. So businesses have various different systems that don't always say the same thing at the same time to everybody. Not everybody has access to all the different systems. The team in the warehouse might not see what's on Shopify, for example, and vice versa. So what we want to do is just help bridge the gap between some of those systems, and we'll get better with that over time. And this is a step on that journey. But ultimately, like any system, you get at what you put in. The more data we receive, or whether it's for RMA or for sales orders, for anything is in the system, the more we can do with that data, and vice versa. So now, as we'll lean on our guest speaker, Matt, for some help with some of the FAQs, and there will be a chance to ask some questions later on as well. If you do think of anything in the meantime, please feel free to pop it into the chat. So Matt, first question, quite a simple one. Why are we doing this?
So the returns and RMA logic is it's been a bit of a feature gap in the system for a little while now. You mentioned that that blind returns process in the past about not having visibility of what's actually arriving at the warehouse, not being able to validate that something is coming in correctly. We're trying to essentially meet some of the trends that we're seeing in the market, and a lot of the trends that we're seeing recently are towards people using returns portals. And people need to be able to see that inbound data coming into the warehouse before it actually gets there. We've got some people working today with some workarounds using purchase orders to track those inbound goods, but there are a few nuances to the process of performing a return that make it essentially warrant its own process separate from the standard purchase order receipt process. So we're just trying to essentially cover that feature gap and try and work with some of the other partners on the market with returns.
Thank you for that, Matt. Moving on to the next one, you touched on this a little bit in your previous answer, but could you give us some examples of the problems that this can help solve?
So the main problem that it's trying to solve is visibility on that inbound process. So at the moment, unless you know how many returns you're expecting to actually receive on a given day, it's very difficult to plan resourcing. You don't know how many people you're going to need in the warehouse assigned to running those returns. Our hope is that by providing the ability to upload those RMAs, you'll be able to get a better feel for what's expected to arrive at the warehouse, and you can then plan your staffing needs around that. We're also looking to streamline the workflow a little bit. So we've essentially done some analysis on the way people use the returns process today. And we're trying to strip out some of those unnecessary steps. So for example, the comments in the notes section, that has very low usage today. So what we're trying to do is essentially pull that part out of the process and move that onto the RMA itself. So if you do need to add any notes to the return, anything to check or anything that you think might be suspicious, you can put that on the RMA itself and avoid having to put the user through actually typing something in during the returns process itself. Same for printing. Anything we can do to avoid manual interaction with the screen, just trying to streamline that workflow, automate the printing process, and allow people to essentially process that return as quickly as possible and then move on to the next one. And it also serves as a jumping off point for some future enhancements. We're not quite in a position to talk about the details of those just yet, but we are hoping that we can tie into some of the upcoming put away functionality as well. So when you're returning the item, today we have some basic logic that essentially looks at the item. If it's good stock, if it's undamaged, you can put it away into a pick face location. If it's damaged, then it has to go into quarantine. We'd like to see if we can extend that a little bit more and actually provide some more targeted recommendations on where to put those items based on some of that put away logic.
Thank you, Matt. And this one, I think, is a really important question for the operations people here today. The guys in the warehouse where on any given day, raw mail might turn up with a lot of returns. So how could somebody plan for a wave of returns using this?
So we've got a couple of ways that you could do this. The main use case that we're trying to plan around is essentially running a report. So we're going to be providing 2 new reports, one on returns that we've already processed, so we can check your actual returns against the expected RMA states. That'll allow you to validate that you are actually processing things correctly. But specifically for planning ahead, we'll also have a new report which is based on the RMA itself, which will include the expected delivery date of those RMAs. So you'll be able to, for example, ask the system which returns they're expecting to receive over the coming week, and then you can use that to essentially generate your rota in the warehouse and work out how many people you need staffing those benches.
So using that expected delivery date, Matt, that will be triggered by the returns portal. So could that be from when the return is collected plus 2 working days, for example?
Yeah, exactly. Depending on the service type that you select, or if there's any other logic that you want to put in there. Essentially, we just need to be told some rough date when we're expecting to receive that. But if you need to update that in the future before it actually gets received, we'll support that as well.
Perfect. So when we talk about processing returns faster, we've got data capture on the portal, as in maybe this t-shirt's the wrong color. How will that help make the return faster for the user in the warehouse?
So I started to touch on this earlier, but there's a couple of key ways that we can process these faster. So the number one way that we can do this is by optimizing for the most common workflow. And like I said earlier, we saw very low usage on the comments and the notes section. So we're trying to remove that from the process altogether. We're also trying to avoid the keyboard and mouse interaction in every possible scenario. So the happy path, the day-to-day, assuming there are no discrepancies and everything is as it should be, we're basically trying to allow people to interact with the workflow entirely using a barcode scanner. So you'll start by scanning the sales order or the RMA, and then you'll scan the item to choose that. And then from there, you'll be able to scan things like the return state, the return condition, and the location that it's going to go into. And every time you scan, it'll move on to the next prompt automatically. Similarly, when you get to the end of the process, you won't have to manually choose which items you want to print. We'll be able to generate those labels if you need to for example, print a new item barcode. We can trigger that print automatically. I think that's really the key thing. We're also trying to standardize the workflow between the web and the mobile. So if you do need to change things up for any reason, if you get a large number of returns and it's easier to take a device out to the goods rather than logging the returns over to a bench somewhere, the users should already be familiar with the workflow. So we'll be able to essentially replicate whatever process we have on the web on the mobile device as well.
Thank you. But at what point does a customer get refunded? I think this is quite important to help eliminate some negative reviews for slow refund potentially.
Yeah, so you've got a couple of options here. Ultimately, it's up to you and your returns partner. The key thing is that you'll be able to refund essentially at any point in the process, depending on how confident you feel about the customer, whether it's a fraudulent transaction or anything like that. Our goal with the returns process itself is to provide you with visibility on the actual versus the expected state. So you'll be able to check for example, whether the condition is what the condition should be based on the return. If somebody says it's undamaged, we'll be able to notify the returns portal that actually it is undamaged, or maybe there was some smoke damage, or there was a tear or something like that the customer didn't notify you about. We'll expose all of that information using our existing integration framework, and you'll be able to then use that to drive your decisions around whether to process that refund immediately, or if you wanted to defer it and have somebody manually inspect it, or do a second touch just to confirm that there's no fraud going on, or they haven't returned the wrong item or anything like that, for example.
That leads me on quite nicely to my next question. How can we help stop fraudulent returns? There's always an element of this, regardless of which industry you're in, most likely around sale period, where it's hard to put in place the processes to capture every possible type of return. So how can this help?
So I mentioned some of those safety checks that we're putting in place. So we'll be able to expose the return state and the condition on both the RMA and also on the return itself. So you'll be able to reconcile those. That's useful for looking back and checking whether or not something is or potentially looks fraudulent based on what you've already received. But we also have the ability to expose some of that data to the end user who's actually processing the return as well. So if there is a fraud marker on the customer, or if there's something that looks a little bit suspicious about the item that's being returned, you'll have the ability to put that on the RMA itself, and we can pull that in from the returns portal. And then we can configure how much of that we actually want to show to the end user doing the return. So it could be that, for example, some items are particularly prone to fraud. We can put a comment on the item attribute, and we can display that during the returns process. It could be that some customers have been returning a lot of items, purchasing and then returning them straight away. So again, that's something which you could put on either the RMA itself or maybe on the sales order, and then we can pull that through and show that to the user. So based upon that, the person doing the return can then decide whether or not they want to escalate this to a supervisor or potentially, inspect the item a little bit more closely just to make sure that there isn't anything strange going on there.
Thank you. And this question does apply to quite a few of our customers, maybe as they open up different sales channels in different areas and not quite got a full warehouse yet in those different regions. So how could we handle returns not sent from the Peoplevox warehouse?
Yeah, it's a good question. So today that is a bit of a blind spot for us. We have the returns process today, which is essentially tied to the original sales order shipped from Peoplevox. What we're trying to do is extend that so that the returns process going forward will either be tied to the original sales order or to the RMA record. So the RMA doesn't necessarily have to correspond to a sales order. If you, for example, shipped items from a mortar store, or if you're doing drop shipping, or if you have a 3PL doing some of your distribution, essentially, so long as you provide us with an RMA saying these are the items that we're expecting to return, then we'll be able to return the items against those. The main kind of use case that we're trying to solve for here is allowing you to return anything that we're expecting. So long as you provide us with the RMA, we can then return the items against that, and you can either link that to a sales order during the process or ahead of time if you have that if you have the sales order already in Peoplevox, or you can leave it completely unlinked if you want to as well. That's totally fine. There's no requirement to tie it up to the original sales order. The only advantage that you might get from tying it up to the sales order, if you have that data in the system, is that you'll then be able to see both the original order data and the RMA data alongside one another when you're running some of those reports. So we'll have that additional context, and you'll be able to see the original shipping information against the returned item information, for example.
Thank you. And you touched on brick and mortar. So if I was a retailer offering different types of returns options to my customer, and one of them was returning to a retail store, how would that work, or could it work with Peoplevox?
Yeah, so you've got a couple of options here. You can either ship those back piecemeal, so as they arrive at the brick and mortar store, you can ship them back to the warehouse, each with their own individual RMA, and we can process those separately. That's no problem. The other option is if you wanted to collect those up as essentially a bulk order and ship them back as a single unit, you can submit one large RMA that covers all of those items. And when those arrive at the warehouse, we'll have the ability to either go through and scan and validate each one of those items, or if you've already done that scanning and the validation in the store itself, there'll be the ability to essentially do a quick return. So you'll be able to accept the state and the condition from the RMA, and rather than having to scan that for every item, we can just pre-populate all of that. And then all you'll have to do is essentially click, yes, I accept this RMA, return all of these items, and then specify where in the warehouse you actually want to put those items. So the idea is to kind of streamline some of that bulkier returns for the items coming back from the brick and mortar store.
Thank you. Coming to the last of the FAQs, the last few. So what you've said sounds interesting. I'd like to try it. How can I get access and support?
So the main thing to do is keep an eye on our release notes. So we are pushing the updates out every couple of weeks. We'll hopefully have something available to show you in the next 2 to 4 weeks. We're kind of going through our early access beta testing phase at the moment. So as soon as we have something available to share, we'll let you know on the release notes. And if you're interested in becoming an early access partner, feel free to reach out either to your CS manager or on the support portal. We can get you added to that list. And we'll essentially be able to enable these new screens to go alongside your old returns process. So you won't necessarily have to replace your entire process wholesale. You can just, for example, give access to a couple of users, trial the new process, see if anything doesn't work for you, or if you find anything that you think we can improve on. And then we're certainly open to feedback on all of that. the process, the idea behind this early access process is really to try and get feedback from you as early as possible so that we can iterate on this and essentially get it into a position where everyone's happy with it going into the peak period this year.
Okay. So that leads us on to the last two parts of either what else can we see today? And we've also got a couple of questions in the chat. So Matt, up to you. Would you like to do the questions first?
Yeah, let's do the questions, and then I can always share some of those mock-ups afterwards if we need to, if we run out of time.
Perfect. So the first question is from Kelly. Can it handle rejected returns?
That's a good question. So this is something which we went back and forth on during the original design and some of the conversations that we had internally. At the moment, the plan is that essentially if the return's been rejected, then we would reject the return. We would essentially reject the RMA and not allow the item to be returned. That is what we're planning to do for phase one. But I think that is definitely something which we could change going forwards. It's important that we are able to handle the items as they return, as they essentially arrive at the warehouse. We need to be able to do something with them. The last thing that we want to do is leave them hanging around in the warehouse without being able to scan them into stock. So today, I think for the early access, we probably won't be able to handle those rejected returns. But if that's something that you experience frequently, that's useful feedback, and we can definitely look to include that in a future phase.
Next question is from Andrea. How will RMA deal with the return of bundles of kits, but only a part of the components are being returned?
Yeah, another good question. So essentially, when we're working with bundles and components in the warehouse, we always deal with the individual components themselves. So even if you've ordered a kit consisting of 5 different products, the physical handling of those products will always be at the component, the individual item level. So we'll be able to return those independently. We won't require that the user has to return the entire kit itself, and we'll expose that information as well. So we won't require that you have to return the entire bundle, and the information that we expose to the returns portal will just be the kit component piece. So then you'd be able to work with your returns portal to decide how to actually handle that in terms of a refund, whether you want to issue a refund for the entire kit or if you just want to do a partial refund based on how much of the overall kit that individual item comprises.
All right, thank you. The next question from Andrea is, can we integrate the portal into the website customer area? So I don't mind doing this one, Matt. So if you've got your website, mywebsite.com/returns, that page could maybe be a white label returns portal for your brand that could take on the look and feel of your website. Or potentially it could be a separate thing sent out to the customer, separate link to customers where they place their order, saying click here to process a return. The page they land on provided by the returns portal, where you'd capture the information, generate a shipping label potentially and tracking information for that. And that's the data from that portal that's then provided to Peoplevox to then link the RMA together. And the next question's from Craig. Will this support units of measure and composite barcode scanning?
Interesting. So this is another one that we talked about during the initial design process. The first phase probably won't include composite barcodes. The reason for that is the primary use case that we saw for this was individual customer returns. So typically not dealing with larger cases or multiple units of the same product at once. But it is something that we've left the door open for as part of our development. So this is something which we can very easily extend going forwards if that is a key requirement. But I think it's something that we'd want to have a little bit more of a detailed conversation about, just to make sure that we understand the wider use case around that. If this is a useful thing for us to be able to include, then it could indicate that there are some wider use cases with some additional requirements that we need to be aware of. But phase one, I think we probably won't have this, but going forward, it's definitely something which we can include.
Thank you. And the last question in the chat from the control warehouse. How would it work if we offer exchanges and refunds? I suppose to keep it, but the normal refund process, we kind of touched on where the items come back. If they're in a condition that you consider to be refundable, maybe double checked by the user in the warehouse, then that satisfies the criteria for a refund, therefore a refund can be issued. What about exchanges, Matt? That's always been a strange scenario sometimes.
Yeah, so I think this is primarily going to come down to the integration between your returns platform and your sales platform. The way we would typically handle this is we'd still want to go through the standard pick, pack, ship process for the exchange. So I would suggest that the best way to handle this would be for the returns portal to essentially generate a sales order, or for customer support to go into the returns portal and check for those exchanges and then raise a sales order for those. And then we would essentially handle those like we would a standard customer order coming in straight from the website. We'd then be able to put a comment against the order indicating that it was an exchange, so that would show up on reporting. But essentially, that would allow you to benefit from the standard, operational pick, pack, ship process. And then if you need to do another return subsequently, you've got the sales order that you can return it against there as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. That's all the questions from the chat. So we could talk about what else could we see today.
Cool. Let me just share my screen then really quickly, and I'll show you some of the wireframes that we have. So full disclosure, these are pretty rough. They are just the ones that we've been using internally for our development and R&D team. But I'll show you what we have so far. So this is essentially what the new process is going to look like. We have, if I go back a couple of steps here. So we've got our scan box at the top here. You'll notice that we've essentially condensed that multi-step workflow onto a single screen. So you start by scanning your order or your RMA, as we have in the past. Once you've done that, we'll be able to load the sales order or the RMA data, which includes the items that we're expecting to see on that return. And then from there, like I mentioned, you won't have to click around. We'll take the scan directly into the item scan box down here, where you can start to then scan the items. And we can pre-populate some of this information based on the return reason and the return state coming from the RMA. But then you'll just have to scan the location here. And then once you do that, again, it takes you back up where you can scan the next item, and you essentially loop through, taking each item one at a time until you submit the final return. At the end of that, you'll get a notification up here saying that we're done with that return. You've completed that. That's based on this autocomplete return flag up here. So if you don't want to do that for any reason, if you maybe want to spend a bit more time examining these items after you've put them away, you can switch this off. And we've also got another one up here for automatically printing after the return. So typically we'd expect people to automatically generate the label for every item as they're going through. And we've already had some good feedback around how that process will work with printing multiple labels. But essentially, this will allow you to generate those labels at the end of the process as soon as you finish scanning. If for any reason you did want to print additional labels during the process, then you've got the option to print labels for individual items, as well as printing them for all of the outstanding items that you have left to return. So giving a bit more flexibility where you need it, but ideally trying to avoid clicking around unless you have. We've also got a similar process for the mobile, so I can show you some of the workflows that we have there. But it would be a similar sort of process where you're scanning the order or the RMA data, and then from there it's taking you through the same sort of process where you're scanning the individual items. You've got the same options for automatically completing the return, automatically printing the item labels, and you're just essentially capturing the destination location and the reason and the condition if you need to as well there. But essentially, we're trying to keep the process as consistent as we can and just streamlining that workflow across both applications. And we'll hopefully have some more detailed wireframes and some example documentation going up onto the help desk pretty soon. We do want to spend a bit more time iterating, and if there are any follow-up questions to this, we definitely want to make sure that we answer those and incorporate that feedback into the design. So we'll be updating that, and we'll be essentially working on refining that design a little bit more before we generate that documentation. But fingers crossed, in the next 2 to 4 weeks, we'll have something for you to play with. And shortly thereafter, we'll also start to put up some documentation, which will include some of these workflows, so you can share that within your team if you want to get a better idea.
Thank you for sharing that, Matt. It's always nice to have a little sneak peek of what's coming up and a little glimpse of the new UI.
Yeah,
So that's good to see. We've had a couple more questions come in. One from Jim, if you're okay for time still, Matt.
Yeah, sure.
Will we be able to generate RMAs using our sales credits in Brightpearl? Currently, Peoplevox purchase orders are being generated using Brightpearl sales credits. I'm not sure if it's more of a question for you or the integration partner.
Yeah, I think ultimately the integration framework will definitely support that, and we have a few use cases where people are using purchase orders today to essentially handle this process. The idea is that we're going to be providing an alternative, but we'll still support the old process as well. So over time, we'll be able to integrate with the new workflow. It'll basically essentially, we're trying to solve the same requirement in both cases, but using the new RMA approach will give you a bit more flexibility, specifically around some of those things that we didn't handle particularly well using the purchase order process. So things like tracking the condition and the return reason. Those are things which we never really had a great solution for using the purchase order process. So essentially, yes, we will work with partners to help them transition to the new RMA process and away from that purchase order.
Perfect. And the final question from Craig: do you still scan it to a location if it's damaged? Yes, and a quarantine location would probably be the best bet to stop the item from being sellable again.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, we'll validate that during the returns process as well. So depending on the condition of the item, that'll be tied to a state, which is either essentially good or bad. If it's good, then you can return it to wherever you like. If it's bad, then we'll pop up a little message during the returns process that tells the user it has to go to a quarantine location.
I think that stops a bad SKU from getting back into circulation.
Exactly, yeah.
Perfect. Looks like that's all the questions. Thank you everybody for joining and taking time out of your day. I appreciate you staying on a little bit longer as well. Some nice feedback from Dave saying it looks really good and a good feature to be released. Thank you, Dave. Really appreciate that. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for your time. Special thank you to Matt as well for joining as our guest speaker on this webinar. Really appreciate all the questions everyone sent. If you have any questions afterwards, please feel free to reach out in the email to myself. And I'm looking forward to helping.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for your time, everyone. Take care.